This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Today, I think we're going to have a lot of fun here with our guest, Frida. You were kind of setting this up and finding out a little bit about our guest, John Prain, who is a backpacker, also known as the Isle Royale guy. Tell us a little bit about what we're in for here and how you kind of came to find John.
Well, you know, when you start talking about Lake Superior and the national parks on Lake Superior, well, folks always come up and say, you know, Isle Royale, it's on my bucket list. And I'm saying, get that bucket going, buddy, because, you know, really what you need to think about is to go to Isle Royale, you basically have like the middle of April to like the middle of October. It's not a full calendar unless you're lucky enough to be on winter study. And then we've already talked about that's about 4 people. That's
a very limited exposure. Yeah.
But so you get there and you make your plans, you get your reservations, you get that brand new backpack, all those great things about the trip. But how do you really prepare? And when you get on the websites and you start looking at, especially a Facebook page, and somebody says, oh, I'm going to hike end to end in a week. Then you're like,
Sure you are.
You need to talk to somebody who's been there, done that, and now is called the Isle Royale guy.
Yeah.
And that's John, and we're so glad to have him with us today.
Yep, John Prain with us here on the podcast. Hello, welcome to the podcast, John.
Hey, thanks, Walt and Frida. Glad to be here. It's going to be interesting. We'll see where this goes.
Yeah, that's the way we roll with it every time, too. So, backpacker, the Isle Royale guy, can you tell us a little bit about maybe your background and how you got into backpacking at Isle Royale, and maybe a little bit how the Isle Royale guy came along?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts. So, I mean, I started doing this stuff at about 9 in various places. Always wanted to get to Isle Royale. You know, as Frida was mentioning, it's on everybody's bucket list. Mm-hmm. And I was in my late 40s. It wasn't until 2009 before I went to Isle Royale. But since that time, you know, this next time I go will be my 20th time to the island since 2009. So I go once or twice a year. I skipped, I think 2014, it was a year I went to the Tetons, Yellowstone, Cascades, had some family weddings, so I couldn't really get any more time off. But that's the only time I've missed. But other years I've gone twice. The Isle Royale guy, I'm on a couple of the different Facebook and other groups, and I tend to comment probably too much and too lengthy. But then a few years ago, I was hiking, and folks would come up to me and say, you're that guy from the website, or you're the Isle Royale guy. And there were folks who actually, I find it interesting and weird, but there were folks who asked for autographs. There were folks posing for selfies, and it's just, I'm just a normal guy who, you know, comments on Facebook pages, and there's folks asking for selfies.
Now, let me jump in here real quick, John. I got to say, you're just a normal guy, but you talk about going to Isle Royale twice a year. That's a serious commitment. I mean, obviously you enjoy this, and we'll talk about what brings you back, but twice a year or so, that's some pretty serious commitment. That's why they're recognizing you. That's why you're talking about it. But what's fun about that for you?
what's fun about going to Isle Royale, for me, I find Isle Royale, you hear folks talking about their, quote, happy place. Or, for me, it's a place where I feel relaxed. It's a place where I feel really connected to nature, connected to God. I'll just point out I am a pastor. I like seeing Lake Superior. So for me to be around Lake Superior is great. I like the wildlife. I love seeing the moose. I got hundreds of moose pictures that I've taken, the sunrises, the sunsets. But I think for me, the biggest part, I like the relative remoteness of it. Now, there's other people. There really are other people there. I'm not saying you're going totally alone, but it's not as crowded as it could be. And, cell phone service doesn't work real well, if at all, there, depending upon where you're at. So I'm really able to disconnect, and unplug. And I think that's what keeps, bringing me back. I can just get away from everything for a while.
John, 2 decades. It's just fabulous to just think about all of those trips. What has changed? First of all, let's say what's changed at Isle Royale in that time since 2009?
We've started to get more and more people coming there. So I think it's a bit more crowded. I think what that also does is, you have to do your booking of things like your transportation months in advance. You sometimes get lucky and get in quicker, but, I had my stuff booked by February and, I didn't get my exact dates already. There's folks now, if you're going to be at the lodge or that, you better be talking 9 to 12 months out to try to book your lodging if you're going to be at a lodge or a cabin. It's just, that's, I think, how some things have changed. I saw the ups and downs with the wolves especially, but also the moose. When first time I came there, I think there was something like 24 wolves on the island, and then it got down to 2, and then maybe less. That's a little iffy there. And then they, brought in some more wolves, and we've seen them start to, to reproduce, and the numbers go up again. And then, consequently, the moose population going up and down along with that. So those are some of the things I've seen change on the island.
And John, how has those 20 visits, how has that changed you?
I think when I came there the first couple of times, I was both good and bad overwhelmed. Yeah, it's a unique place. It's out there in the middle of Lake Superior, and everything I was seeing was new. So it was that, oh, wow. And there's still, oh, wow, but it's a different kind of, oh, wow. The first time is just, you're just blown away. Now it's more like I'm coming home to a familiar place. It's a place where I feel at peace. And again, I don't have to think as hard. When I've hiked all the trails on the main island, a minimum of 3 times, some of them 6, 7, 8 times. So it's not a totally new experience, so I can enjoy things more, if that makes any sense.
It does.
I'm more familiar with it, and I'm less worried about things because, there's more, you got this.
Right.
So it's, if that makes sense to folks.
It does. And I'm curious about one thing, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about these regular visits in a bit, but you talk about going, over these last couple decades, 20 some times. Is there an Isle Royale guy's favorite way of getting there? Or do you use the same way all the time? Or have you tried different options with getting to the island?
I tried everything. My first trip was over on the Isle Royale Queen, which is, out of Copper Harbor. Mm-hmm. I've gone a few times on the Ranger 3 out of Houghton. Mm-hmm. I've taken the Voyager 2 and the Sea Hunter 3 out of Grand Portage, and that's probably where I go the most. And then during the COVID year, I took the seaplanes. And I took those out of Grand Marais over in Minnesota.
Sure.
But I even remember, and I did take one trip on the Winona, which was one of the earlier boats that operated out of Grand Portage, Minnesota. So I've taken just about all the ways. And one time I came back with some people even on a private boat. So that's about all the ways you can do.
You've done a lot with that. Now, getting back to, and we're talking with John Prain here. We call him the Isle Royale guy. He's a backpacker. He's got a history with Isle Royale. You mentioned, John, you're a pastor, and you mentioned that this is a place that you're at peace at. What is sort of maybe the spiritual connection, without getting into like hyper deep with religion, but like getting into this kind of space that reaffirms your faith or your spirituality. And that's a real big part for the big lake for me, for a lot of people. What is it about going to Isle Royale and being out there that helps you sort of center yourself that way?
I'm going to maybe steal from a guy. I was at a conference recently, and it was at a church camp. And this guy was talking about all the generations that had been at that church camp. And he said, I can't remember his exact words, but he said it's a special place. He said where the barrier between humanity and God is a bit thinner and we can feel closer. I guess for me, maybe that's it. I think we get so busy in day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. We got the TV on, the radio, the phone's ringing. I get away from all of that. I'm just able to focus on nature, on God, live in the moment, I guess. I think that's one of the biggest things.
That is spoken from somebody that really knows the depth of what that park is all about. And we're so grateful that we have those places on Lake Superior. But with 165 miles of trail and 36 campsites and really helping people understand they need to book, how do you coach first-timers so that they can make the most out of their trip?
It might seem, for lack of a better word, counterintuitive, but I tell folks to focus on less is more. Folks want to get out there. They want to go across the island in 3-4 days, and we're just going to see it all. But they're going so fast. They don't slow down their own pace, their own life, their own brain. It's all focused on getting to the next camp, on what to do next. And they miss things. They walk by moose. They walk by the flowers. They don't smell things. They don't take in the views. It's just rush, rush, rush. And so the first thing I say, less is more. If you see less of the island and you really spend time focusing on it, you're actually going to get more out of it. You're going to see more moose. You're going to relax more. Do those things. Put down your electronic device and just live in that moment and enjoy what's there.
Absolutely. And they will, that sense of awe that you get every time you come around a corner or you climb up that ridge or you're in that cove and you feel like you're the last person on the planet in that special place, for sure. Is there anything else, say the practical side of planning this trip?
Oh, yeah.
What else would you say to folks?
Some of the practical things, I tell them it's probably going to take you longer to get from point A to point B than you plan. That this is different than other places you've been. You might have been to 1,001 hiking spots, but Isle Royale is probably going to be different than most of them. The trails are narrower. There's lots of rocks and roots, ups and downs, watery places on the trail, muddy places on the trail, narrow boardwalks. You're going to be hiking slower than you were. Mm-hmm. Water, it might look like it's really close on the map, but if anybody's been to Isle Royale, they also know you might be just 100 feet from a water source. But between you and that water source, even something the size of Lake Superior might be so much undergrowth, cliffs, swamps that you can't get to it. So you really have to start the day by bringing all the water you're going to need for the day and just plan you're not going to find any more as you hike. If you find some that you can filter and drink, great, but don't plan on it. And then the other thing I say is don't overpack and carry so much weight that it just makes your life miserable. So I think those are some of the things I focus on.
And I think it's really good when folks practice, load that pack up ahead of time and wear those boots ahead of time. And I mean, even wear those shorts and that top just to see, is it going to chafe when you have all those, your straps on and everything else? Is it going to be what you're going to be comfortable in? Because that's the biggest thing about just making sure that you can keep moving. You're moving under your own power. There's not anybody that's going to do the hike for you. You've got to do it on your own two legs.
To add to that, folks, it kind of goes to the last question, but also going farther. Isle Royale really is remote. If you don't have something, you just can't go out and get it.
Right.
You really are on your own. You have to be ready to do self-rescue, self-first aid if something goes wrong. If you discover you don't have all your tent poles, you're not getting one. So you have to have some skills, but you also have to be prepared. So along with what you were saying, I encourage folks to do a couple of trips where they hike real miles. Some folks hike around the block. No, if you plan on doing like 8 miles a day, do a couple of days back to back of 8-mile hiking using the exact same gear, trying to use the same type of food. There's nothing worse than getting out in the middle of Isle Royale, discovering all this food you bought, you don't like it, or you don't know how to cook it.
Right.
So be ready and practice before you get there.
Absolutely. I have a story to share that we were down at Huggin Cove and we were kayaking, circumnavigating the island, and we ran into a gal and she was trying to make her butane stove work. Well, come to find out she bought the wrong canister to match with her stove. And we had extra canisters, so we provided it for her. And she was so grateful because she wasn't going to be eating anything. Everything she had was dehydrated, so she was going to have to heat some water somehow. But she came to our tent later and she had a brownie that she had made and packed ahead. And, that was really special. I think we were on the water at that point, maybe about 4 days. So to have a fresh brownie, it was like, no problem. You can have our propane canister. We're going to really enjoy this brownie.
And here, John, the thing that I'm hearing, you're talking about first-timers originally, but even for veteran backpackers, this really does apply, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Every year, just even going similar to what I said a moment ago, I'll talk about with every year. I get that gear out. I check it. I test it. I work with it just to make sure it's all there and it's all working. Because, again, I don't care if it's my 20th trip. If all the parts aren't there or if it's not working, I'm still in a mess. So that's what I'd recommend. And to folks that have never even been to the island, but they've been lots of other places, I would invite them to to assume and to believe that they don't know everything about Isle Royale just because they've been to lots of other parks and other hikes or other canoeing places. Isle Royale and Lake Superior are their own things. They're different. So give it the respect it needs and be prepared.
Talking with John Prain here today on the Lake Superior podcast. He's the Isle Royale guy. He's a backpacker. We're talking about his many visits to Isle Royale, the national park, and also a little bit about what to expect there. Let's talk a little bit about, John, in terms of when you go, do you have a favorite trail or a location? Is there a time of year? Tell me a little bit about some of the favorite elements for you when you do your visit to Isle Royale.
My first blush answer is this is almost like asking a parent publicly to say who their favorite kid is.
Right, yeah. Right. We understand.
I like all the campgrounds and all the trails, but, they're all for different reasons and at different times. So I think it depends a little bit upon my day and how I'm feeling. But some of them that I like the Feldman Loop and the Huggin Loop, which are on the Wendigo or western side of the island. I really like those. On the eastern side of the island, I like hiking up by Mount Franklin and Mount Ojibwe. That's on the eastern or Rock Harbor side. Some of my favorite campgrounds, I like Feldman Lake, Siskiwit Bay campgrounds. I like Todd Harbor and Little Todd Harbor on the Menung Ridge Trail. But I always want to give a warning when I mention the Menung Ridge Trail. In my opinion, that's a trail that you really shouldn't go on unless you have some experience with Isle Royale, but also some really good experience camping and backpacking, because it's very remote. It's very easy to get turned around. There's places where the trail just disappears, or you have 6 moose trails there. So you really shouldn't go there as a beginner if you don't have a lot of skills. But, that's where I like Little Todd Harbor and Todd Harbor campgrounds, but that's not necessarily a place for everyone.
How about your time of year?
Time of year. I've gone in June, July, and August. Due to work schedule things, August tends to be the time I go most often, so I guess that's probably my favorite because of that. I tend to catch it a lot of times right at that sweet spot near the end of the month of August when folks are starting to go back to jobs and schools and colleges. But, it's still summer and things are open yet on the island. So it's kind of that a little bit less crowd, but still everything open.
Talking with John Prain here today, who's the Isle Royale guy, a backpacker, talking about Isle Royale and camping and hiking and visiting it. When you go and you're packing, what particular are maybe some of your favorite pieces of gear? And One other sort of follow-up on that is there a piece of gear that you like to take with you that some might say, oh, what is he taking that for? But it's a personal favorite of yours. Tell us about that.
Yeah. One of the things I do is I tend to be one of those crazy ultralight or super ultralight backpackers. Mm-hmm. Not all the time, but often. So I tend to go with really light stuff. I like my current pack. It's my favorite pack that I've had in a long time. It's a Gossamer Gear Murmur backpack. Again, Gossamer Gear Murmur. You can configure it in different ways. That pack can weigh as little as 8 ounces or as much as 13 ounces empty. So that's a really light pack. My current stove cooking pot. It's by Toaks. I think I'm pronounced that correct. Toaks. It's their 550 milliliter titanium cooking pot. It holds, about 2 cups, 2 ounces of water. The pot weighs 1.9 ounces, and if you got the lid on it, 2.6 ounces. I really like those small ones. They really work well for me as an ultralight backpacker. I see these folks, they're alone or there's just 2 people, and maybe you've seen them on trails if you go out or out on the water. That there's 2 people and they got this big 10-quart cooking pot. Why take a 10-quart cooking pot for 2 people? So keeping things small, that one works for me. Some things that other folks might think is a little frivolous. This one isn't really out there, but trekking poles or hiking stick. Mm-hmm. There's still folks who say, oh, you don't need that. In my opinion, on Isle Royale, you better take trekking poles or a hiking stick. The trails are so uneven. You're on narrow boardwalks. There's lots of up and down. You might be hiking in the early morning when there's lots of cobwebs and spider webs, and it's good to hold the hiking stick or trekking pole out in front of you to kind of, break the way so you don't get all that in your face. So I don't think I'd go without trekking poles. And again, folks will disagree, but the National Park Service and the CDC say you should both filter the water in Isle Royale and chemically treat it or treat it with ultraviolet device. I had a waterborne illness, not on Isle Royale, but Boundary Waters about 45 years ago. So I like to listen to the National Park Service and the CDC. I both filter my water and I treat it. And a lot of folks say, well, you don't need to treat that, so.
And a little bit of a warning, if you do decide to go take a dip in Chicken Bone Lake, you may come up with leeches.
Yeah.
And that's another thing to mention about Isle Royale, particularly later in the summer, but sometimes we see it as early as June. There's some of the lakes, the inland lakes, not Lake Superior, that get blue-green algae blooms. You can't filter it out. You can't boil it out. You can't treat it to get rid of it. The water is toxic. So, yeah, you have to be ready at times to shift and adjust and carry more water than you plan. So I always bring, like an empty container or something, a flexible one that I can use if I end up discovering that the lake has an algae bloom and I have to get water from a farther distance and carry a bit more.
You mentioned a waterborne illness when you were at another site, but has there been a time that maybe you've had a visit to Isle Royale that's been either waylaid by something like that, an injury perhaps, or weather, which we know can turn real quick? Anything like that?
Oh, yeah. It can happen to anybody at any time because the weather at Isle Royale, and particularly on Lake Superior, is so unpredictable. On my 2020 trip, I was delayed by roughly 24 hours. I got a call the day before, and they said, hey, your trip's not going tomorrow. It was delayed by 24 hours due to weather issues. And then at the end of that trip, same thing, delayed 24 hours for me. But there were other people who had been, I was at Rock Harbor on the eastern end. They had already been there 2 days waiting before I got there. So for some of these people, it was a 3-day wait because of being fogged in. So you got to be prepared. And there were folks going absolutely nuts. I have to get back to my daughter's wedding, So that's another thing I guess I'd say. Don't plan things super close to the end of your trip that are very important to you because you never know what Lake Superior is going to do.
And we like to say that maybe the only month that there has not been measurable snow in the Upper Peninsula is August, but at Isle Royale, I bet you they have had a dusting. So always be ready for some really wide swings in temperature. When that front moves in, and it can bring rain with it or fog, which for a kayaker, I'd rather be in the rain than I would the fog. The fog is scary for me, but just being prepared that, when you left home, it was maybe high 80s. You get to Isle Royale and it could be hovering right around 40, and 40 degrees and raining can do some damage.
As we talked about preparing folks, I see so many people say, well, what are the typical temperatures to prepare for? I advise people to prepare for the extremes because let's say the average overnight temp is 50 degrees. Well, if it's now 32, being prepared for 50 isn't going to help you much. So I say come prepared for the extremes in weather and for any type of weather, because it could happen no matter what the weather forecast said.
Dry socks and a hat.
Yes.
Yeah. How can people find out more about you as the Isle Royale guy and Isle Royale? I mean, you're a wealth of knowledge, and you must have some place that people can come and check you out because they've found you and did selfies and autographs and all that. Where do they find out more about you?
Yeah, even though I'm just a normal hiker, I want to make that clear. I don't offer a guide service. I don't take money. I'm just a person who just shares my own experience, and it may vary for you what your experience is, but I do have my own website, and it really is one word, theisleroyaleguy.com, theisleroyaleguy.com. But I also recommend people go to the official national park website for Isle Royale, www.nps.gov/ISRO. I always refer people to the official site because that's the important thing, much more than my site, which I think is really good and has lots of good stuff. But you always want the official and latest and greatest from the National Park Service.
John Prain with us here on the podcast, Lake Superior Podcast today. He's a backpacker known as the Isle Royale guy, sharing some of his thoughts on Isle Royale National Park and a visit there. John, I feel like there's somebody somewhere that's going to catch this podcast somewhere on the other side of the world just listening, and you took them there in a really great way today. It's been a pleasure having a chat with you here today. I mean, this has been great.
And John, when are you heading over this year? What month?
Well, it will be August, and the cool thing this year, my record before was 17 days, 16 nights. This year, I'm going to do a 19-day, 18-night trip in August.
Fabulous.
Wow.
Fabulous.
Wow. That is really something. John, it's what I've liked about our chat today is that it sounds like you really enjoy this place. It is truly important to you, but you're also willing to talk about it, which has made a great conversation with us today.
Thank you very much.
John Prain, he's a backpacker known as the Isle Royale guy, talking about his experiences on visiting Isle Royale 20 times or so, 2 decades worth of trips. And Frida, many people will never get close to that. Many will never even make one. I mean, I've never made one, and I'm from up here in this area and grew up with the Ranger 3 in my backyard and the seaplanes and everything. But John really kind of took us on the journey. I think he explained it clearly and eloquently that it's not, just a walk in the park. Literally, it is a challenge, but there are options, and we encourage people to look into Isle Royale National Park.
One of the things I noticed with John, his trips are usually June, July, August, and I would push because I've enjoyed my times there in May and also in September. Now, granted, I don't mind if it gets a little bit chilly. I'm not real fond of the bugs, so don't make me go there the 1st of June or until solstice anyway. But the idea that what you might get as you go earlier or later in the season is it could be a little bit more lumpy on your route over there. But if you go with Tomas and, you take a seaplane, that's going to be a real quick trip for you. And you might get delayed, though. That's another thing to underline is everybody thinks, well, I've got passage. I should be able to leave this day and come home this day. Be prepared because we say it over and over. Well, Lake Superior's the boss.
That's right. I was just going to say that in many of these episodes we've done over the last little while, it's just so we talk about how never take Lake Superior for granted, that it may be one thing at one moment and it could turn. And when it turns, the lake can be something fierce. You're right. Lake Superior and Isle Royale National Park are the boss. If you can't get out of there, you're not getting out of there. That's just the way it's going to be. So keep that in mind if you're interested in making that journey.
Trust the decision of the people that will be, captaining those boats or on the pilots on those planes. They really do know, and they're going to make that decision for your safety.
Well, let's once again thank John Prain, the Isle Royale guy, backpacker, talking with us today. And if there's something that you would like to hear us talk about, maybe there's somebody you know out there that we should have on the podcast, you can find us through the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation website. Get some information to us. We'll see what we can do. And we always want to hear from you if you've got some ideas or you've got some reactions to this podcast and others that we've done. So certainly look it up through the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation website. It's all linked up here on the front end. Wherever you got this podcast, you can find the information there. But that's going to do it for us for another edition of the Lake Superior podcast. I'm Walt Lindola.
And I'm Frida Wara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Wara.
And I'm Walt Lindola. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.